from the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. Glad you're with us tonight. An important discussion about our public schools. A look back at the history of Metro Public Schools and looking forward into the future. It's brought about by an hour-long documentary that is going to be screened across the city. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Happy to have with us Katie Cour. She is president of the Nashville Public Education Foundation, in person, not via Zoom. Thank you for being here.
So good to be here. Thank you, Ben.
This is very important. I saw this documentary. I thought it was very powerful. We'll get into the Nashville Public Education Foundation, why you did this, but this is the essence of this project is that many choose to ignore or deny facts, but inequities in Nashville schools exist and have been knowingly cultivated for more than a century. So that's heavy. It's very important.
Yes.
And I guess expand on that. How do you tackle something so significant?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us tonight, by the way. I'm really happy to be talking about this. You know, we at the Nashville Public Education Foundation started to think about why certain groups of students, certain individual students and certain groups of students were not thriving in our public schools. And so we wanted to take a look back at the policies, the decisions that were made in many cases generations ago that are still affecting the way we do school today. And that was really the impetus of this film. We started investigating a history that we thought we knew about, and once we got into it, we realized that the decisions that were made, again, you know, sometimes around the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, are still very much alive and well, and in some cases really exacerbating inequities in our system today.
This film starts with the 1820s, right? I mean, it starts with a historian saying, if you're going to examine this, we need to go back far, really far. And so why start so far back, and what do we learn by starting so far back?
Yeah, we wanted to do a couple things. First is just explain what the actual key milestones in our history were, and so you see that throughout the film in a variety of ways. But we also wanted to dispel some myths that we knew were circulating in our community and in the nation as a whole. One of which is who prioritizes education, who really thinks that education is valuable and important to their communities. And we have a narrative in some parts of our country that certain communities don't prioritize education as much as others. And so we really wanted to dig into dispelling that myth, understanding what education looked like in a country when it was illegal to teach black slaves and free black people to read and write. And we wanted to see what education meant to them prior to the Civil War and then carry it forward to current times.
You wanted to provide a common foundation for conversations on how public policy has created and maintained inequities and how we are in danger of repeating history.
Yep.
And what do you mean by that?
So, you know, the majority of Nashville's history revolves around two races, white and black. The vast majority of our city's experiences, we only had the two races really prominently in the city until the last 20 years or so, 30 years. And that's when we start seeing an influx of Asian Americans as well as Hispanic, Latinx community. And our city is very different and very much more diverse and vibrant than we ever had when I was growing up here. And so what we mean by the repeating, the patterns that we're seeing is that some of the under-resourced and disenfranchised decisions that we made about black communities in our history are starting to eke back into the way we make decisions today about our Latinx and other communities, where we're not seeing the same types of experiences, opportunities, access for certain students, and in particular our recent immigrants, Latinx community, Asian students, et cetera, than we are for the white majority.
It also highlights how we fought hard to integrate our schools, and I believe there's a soundbite at the end where the concern is that we are going to be segregated again, or I think maybe we even are segregated again, and it's only going to get worse. I guess, I don't want to say it wrong, but are we segregated again? How concerned are you about the fact we are moving toward or already segregated again?
So I'm very concerned about it. We, under court order, after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954, began a very long desegregation process that was a lawsuit that took about 40 plus years to finalize. And under that desegregation process, we integrated our system. In some ways was unfair to certain communities, in particular young black students in our system, but in general, we did have a more integrated system in the 80s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the late 90s, we ended up closing on that desegregation lawsuit and bringing it to fruition. And we did some things in reaction to that lawsuit to try to support certain parts of our community, put more funds into certain schools. But in reality, we ended up desegregating the system again because there was no more court order that was mandating that students have an integrated school experience. And so because of housing, because of where our families live in our city, we have really strongly segregated schools in some parts of our city. And I think we would all agree that that's just not in the best interest of anyone.
It was fascinating to see in the documentary how after there were court orders to integrate, the board was even focused on, I guess, zoning that meant there was segregation and in effect led to segregated schools. And we certainly still live with that in our city, correct?
Yep.
And so that was very interesting to see, and I feel like you must feel like that's important to put in there.
Yeah, I do. I mean, the part that talks about the role of the school board in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when we were under desegregation is really important because we've heard about the stories of violent, angry white riots and mobs who were opposed to integration. But there were also resistance at the school board level and at other city leadership levels that really prevented our system from integrating in the way that it should have. And that was an example where we saw our school board back in the 60s or so really make decisions about where students were going to be zoned to schools based on the racial makeup of that group of families and communities closest to that school. And so again, this resistance almost in an accepted way to integration is part of our history that is important to dig into.
And you're hoping to start a community conversation with this, right? So this is an hour-long documentary. It's going to be screened across the community. And what would you hope people take away? They go and watch it. I know it was screened at the Bell Court, but now you're going to go to other community settings. What do you hope people take away when they go and see this?
So I was a history major in college. I love history. I've always thought that history was important to understand, but not something to make us feel guilty about. I don't believe that people who go to view our film, this documentary, should walk away feeling personally guilty, although of course we can all be better people and better humans. The purpose of the film is to understand why certain things are the way they are today so that we can actually correct that going forward. And so what we're hoping to accomplish from the discussions and conversations that we'll be facilitating at these viewings is a shared conversation about the future of Nashville. What type of city do we want to live in? I mean, I, for one, want to live in a city that prioritizes our kids and does it in a way that's very obvious in every intentional policy and political decision that we make. And sometimes that's obvious that we prioritize our kids. I'm thrilled to see City Council and the Mayor's office fund our school budget this year at such high levels, though I think we need more, personally. But it's not always obvious, and I want a different conversation for the city going forward.
So you're president of the Nashville Public Education Foundation. That's a producer. You produced this.
We did.
And so your goal is to help public schools. That's the goal of the Public Education Foundation. So you're sitting around, and what made you decide, let's do a documentary? Let's tackle this with a documentary.
So I've been working in public education for about 25 plus years, and I've seen a variety of different efforts to reform and change our schools. Some of those efforts were fleeting and left immediately. Some of them are still trying to do something, but we ultimately have not moved the needle as much as I think we all want for our kids and our future. So I think we need to think differently about the way we talk about schools and about what schools need to do what we think that they should be doing. We tend in the United States to put an enormous onus on schools to solve so many of society's problems. You know, we want them to solve integration problems. We want them sometimes to solve public health problems. We want them to solve social, emotional problems. And yet, do we actually resource them and support them in the same way so that they can meet those, you know, very lofty goals that we set for them? That's really, you know, kind of where we want to drive the conversation going forward.
And you're hoping community leaders see this, and just I guess people in general, and think differently about why we are where we are, and maybe change course.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
How important is it to change course, and how do we change course?
Well, I think there are a couple of small steps that can be taken quickly, and then there are things that need to happen over a much longer period of time. So initially, we would like to see a review of our policies, both at the school board level and the city level, to have an eye on equity. You know, are we really driving equity in all of our conversations about policy at the city and district level? And by that, I mean, what does the policy do for each and every student in our school system, as opposed to, you know, what's just an interesting reform idea or an interesting policy to put into place? I want to see the effect of a given policy on students of color, on students with special education supports, on English language students. And until you get to the policy conversation at that level, you really are overlooking the sometimes inadvertent effects that a decent policy can have on certain subgroups.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's fascinating. Okay, the next time it's going to be screened is where and when? It's going to be at University School, I guess?
It is. We're screening it throughout the city of Nashville. Our next viewing is next Thursday night, July 22nd at 5:30 at the University School of Nashville, right by Vanderbilt University. And then we will be doing a screening down at the National Museum of African American Music, which, big plug, please go. It's fantastic. And we have a variety of other screenings throughout the city, and you can find out all about those on our website.
So you want to see community leaders identifying challenges and solutions, encouraging leaders to make the best decision for all students. You'd like to see city leaders starting conversations about a vision for youth that incorporates policy in areas like housing, economic opportunity, transportation.
Right.
Right? So it's more than, education is part of the picture, right?
That's right.
But you'd like to see this bigger conversation.
Right. It goes back to a city that prioritizes children and youth. You can't just depend on the public school system to solve all problems for children and youth. You really need to be looking at it holistically. And so we really want to see, we have so many great nonprofit partners that we work very closely with in Nashville and in a variety of these other areas, transportation and healthcare and housing. And so they're also trying to drive conversations about what is in the best interest of students and families in their policy arenas. And so we would like to see a broader conversation about how we as a community can knit together different policy areas to create a truly visionary city for kids.
Again, I saw it, and it's incredibly ambitious. To go back from 1820 to present day and do it in 1 hour is very ambitious, and it's remarkable. And you interview all kinds of people. You have Phil Bredesen in there, Carl Dean in there, so some past mayors, city leaders. I mean, how tough was it to put this together into, and I'm sure you didn't want it to be 4 hours. I mean, you want it to be digestible 1 hour. How tough was it to put this together?
Well, so we started with the idea of doing, you know, just maybe a brief one-pager on the history, and then that extended to maybe a 20-minute conversation on the history, which of course then led to a longer and longer discussion. Once we started to get, we really drove the conversation with 3 historians who helped us put the pieces together, as well as an historian from MTSU who really helped kind of map out the whole history for us. And those 3 historians you see in the film, Dr. Ainsley Erickson, who wrote a wonderful book and has done a lot of work about desegregation in Nashville, David Ewing, who's kind of Nashville's Nashville's unofficial historian and a great knowledge base of Nashville. And then Linda Wynn, who is at the Historic Commission. And so we got the three of them to really narrate the history, and then they led us down all these other wonderful paths, one of which was finding 5 of the 16 original desegregationists who in 1957 were in first grade in our city, and we had 16 students who desegregated our public schools after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. And getting to know those individuals and hearing their stories and understanding their bravery, walking through these crowds of jeering, sometimes violent people protesting, their participation in public schools was really transformative. And I hope that can come through to our viewers watching the film.
It's profoundly moving. Now, there's some in current climate who would say, why do we need to dredge all this up? Let's move on. That's the past. That's not me. That's not, that's behind us. We've moved on from that. Why bring all this back up? And so what do you say to that?
I think there are certain policies on our books today that we need to either edit completely, revamp, or get rid of, and we can't know which policies are most ineffectual unless we understand why those policies were put in place in the first place. So I really believe that dismantling inequity, which is one of the core missions of the Public Education Foundation, cannot be done if you don't understand the root cause of the inequity in the first place. And so a shared city conversation about why those policies were put into place, and then driving towards greater, better policies that do prioritize equity is really where we're hoping to go.
So, unfortunately, we can't show it because we're also on Facebook, and we air on all kinds of things. So we can't show clips from the film, which again I'm saying is great. But we'll have pictures up from time to time, and we'll just continue our discussion. I encourage you to call in if you have questions, comments, thoughts, whatever. There's the number: 615-737+, 615-737-7587. We will open up the phone lines, take a break, and be back right after this.